My name is Michael Fraiman. I am the director of the Canadian Jewish News Podcast Network. When we first started podcasting at the Canadian Jewish News, we had to use the boardroom, and there was this wall of huge hardcover tomes filled with back issues of the CJN print edition, the old weekly paper dating back to the 60s and 70s. And because our microphone setup was not what you would call professional, my co-host and I had to prop up our microphones on these giant books, these tomes. We were literally recording on top of history. Today, the CJN Podcast Network has around a dozen shows. We're at 2 million downloads all time. Like everything we produce at the CJN, our podcasts are totally free. There's no paywall. You can listen to everything for free forever. But we do rely on the community to keep us going. And you can help. Please visit thecjn.ca/donate to make a tax-deductible donation.
This is Bonjour Chai, the Pushy Pencils edition. I'm Avi Feingold, and I'm here with Phoebe Maltbovi. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, a renewed call for a second antisemitism summit. Do summits even serve a purpose anymore? And we also get into the shuttering of the Broken Pencil zine and what that says about the state of publishing today. Stay tuned. Phoebe, how's it going?
It's all right. How about you, Avi?
I'm doing well. It's another week. It feels like there are more books to talk about and more literary scandals in Canada. But I feel like you are at the center of a mini non-scandal, but I witnessed it from afar. Can you tell us what happened when you reviewed or didn't review a book and then somebody came after you?
Right. So I wrote an essay for my weekly column at the CJN about the different pressures that have been on Jewish fiction writers at different times in history. So I was looking at an essay from 1963 and commentary by the novelist Philip Roth and short story writer also, where he's discussing that different Jewish community leaders were criticizing him at the time for not depicting Jews in a more flattering light. Like, why do you have to make your characters Jewish? Why do you have to make your Jewish characters do nasty things, whatever? And he's sort of defending the value of fiction and all of this, but also defending his right to sort of just be a writer. I mean, the way he phrased it is a little bit more complicated than an American writer, which is its own particularism, but whatever. There was pressure on Jewish fiction writers sort of in the mid-century, in the post-war period, to portray Jews in a positive light if writing about Jews, right? And also this desire, if you wanted to be read by general audiences, not to seem too specific. Fast forward to today, and there's a whole different set of pressures on Jewish fiction writers where it's all about where you stand on Israel stuff. And there isn't really an option of saying, I'm just writing, I'm doing my art. That's what I'm doing. I'm not an expert on the Middle East, and don't come to me for that. This is all a backstory to say that. So I mentioned in this much longer essay the existence of an anthology, a newly published anthology called On Being Jewish Now. There's an event for it. I think the co-hosts are Zibby Owens, who's organized this anthology, and the head of Indigo.
Heather Reisman?
Yes, in Toronto. But basically, I mentioned this anthology and did indeed contrast this to like a Philip Roth novel. I did not say that I had read the anthology. More to the point, I said that I had not yet, because I was planning to, but whatever, but that I had not read the anthology. I was clear that this was not something I read. I was talking about what I had seen from promotional stuff about it, basically that this was something where 75 writers were given 3 weeks to write a brief essay on being Jewish now. 3 weeks during which presumably they had other things to do as well. And that's just going to be a different type of product. And I was basically saying this is activism, you know, and I wasn't saying that in a critical, like, oh, you can't do activism, but I'm saying that is just what it is, you know, like the artists for Palestine, artists for Israel, whatever it is, it's a type of activism. Mm-hmm. So I didn't think much of this. But then one of the contributors, who is, I guess, is she an influencer? She's definitely a branding expert. I don't know how exactly what the parameters are for influencer, made a video a cross-platform video about how I am so terrible because I reviewed a book I hadn't read. Now, I did not review the book, but I'm going to, so stay tuned. but it was just the video, though. Do you want to, can you mention what was fascinating about the video?
Which is the only thing that like I caught in all of this, where I start watching this video and this woman who is ranting about how much she dislikes you because of this purported reviewing for whatever. And she's doing it while she's talking about a makeup product that she's applying to herself, to sort of like, it's not interesting enough for her to rant about you, right? Her listeners basically, or her followers basically, have to see her doing something else at the same time, which is putting on this makeup product to show how glowy and whatever it's going to do for you. That's, you know, neither here nor there. That's where I got all weirded out by it. Look, to be fair, I think people assume wrongly that if you talk about a book in a column that you have read it, even if you explicitly have said, I have not
Avi, I have to stop you here, because people would assume that if it were a book, if it were a column about that book.
Correct.
I don't think that people, yes, I don't think that people would assume if you, in a much longer article, mentioned a bunch of different things, a bunch of different news stories, a bunch of different publications, a bunch of different things in the world, and you mention one book and say explicitly that you have not read that book, I don't think people would say that it was journalistic malpractice, as was coming up in comments somewhere, to have not read that book. It doesn't make any sense. It's just bizarre.
Yeah.
But whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm writing about it now. But that kind of brings us a little bit to other discussions, because it is genuinely like the book is a charitable, activist, however you want to look at it, project, because it benefits an organization.
But it's more than that, because the writers that they asked, I'm sure they asked in it, they knew in advance the types of writers they were asking, who were going to be very pro-Israel or very anti-Semitism. And this was part of the writing that they were assuming they were going to get. They didn't take people who had I haven't even read this, but I'm assuming.
Avi, and you're talking on a podcast about a book you haven't read? Okay, I'm going to start powdering my nose. Yeah, I mean, I think, like, for me, it was just, it was a weird experience, because I don't think that my politics are fundamentally all that different from theirs. I am, a supporter of the existence of Israel. I am a writer attuned to literary world anti-Semitism. I'm not a fiction writer. But what I was going to say is that, like, it's not that my politics are opposed to their politics. It's that I think there should be a space for Jewish writers who are not looking to say anything about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in their work. And it seems like that's what's different today, is that they're just, that space doesn't really exist. You're on one side or another, or you're just like spending a lot of energy trying to say nothing when you know that people want to know what you think about this or this or this.
I agree with that. Speaking of, people gathering together to air all of a very similar opinion, which is whatever. In the past week, there was some hubbub on Twitter about this second summit that is being called for on combating anti-Semitism for the government. So the end of October, Senator Donald Plett had a motion in Senate to urge the government to direct the special envoy, who, if you know, Deborah Lyons is the envoy to combat anti-Semitism, to convene a second national summit to combat anti-Semitism. Senator Paula Simons, she gets part of the discussion, and she says that all of the examples that they've been talking about are anti-Semitism on the left. There's also tremendous anti-Semitism on the right. Yes, we need to do this. And they basically put forth this motion. The motion gets adopted for doing this. That's there. Let's take a step back. Why do you need a second summit? Let's go back to the first summit on anti-Semitism, which happens in 2021 during COVID. So it's on Zoom. It's a 7-hour Zoom. Lots of recommendations come out of it. A year after that, CIJA organizes a conference called Anti-Semitism, Face It, Fight It. They'd been planning this for months, and it ends up going on, even though this is barely a week after October 7th. They're like, now more than ever, we need to have this conference. They get lots of politicians come in for a 2-day event, and now there's a call for a second official summit. So a third in 3 years, basically, if you look at what's been happening this past week, there's been a lot of, here, and yes, we should do this. Anthony Housefather retweeted it. CJ retweeted it. And I'm here to ask you, what is the purpose of all of these summits if they clearly don't seem to be doing anything?
Well, that is a good question you ask. I don't know. It seems like there's a lot of so this is something I've been thinking of, because when you first brought up this topic, I didn't really have much to say about it because I thought, well, there isn't actually an imminent summit, but then I realized like there is a lot of organizing that goes on that is like noble sounding, like who wants there to be anti-Semitism? Well, I guess anti-Semites do, but like obviously all Jews are going to be opposed to anti-Semitism and all nice people, whatever, opposed to it. But like just because a thing is bad doesn't mean that everything done to combat the thing is worthy. And I feel like this is a message with like pretty, like it's not just about anti-Semitism summits, it's about any kind of efforts. Like, is the thing actually helping? Is it possible that it's doing the opposite of what it was intended to do? You know what I mean?
I believe the term you're referring to might be virtue signaling in this situation.
It's that, but it's also just like a lot of times like efforts to, to bring it back to the literary world, like efforts to have diverse books will end up sort of pigeonholing certain authors that they can only write about their group's oppression. You know what I mean? Or they can only write like certain types of stories. And I feel like it's been years I've been thinking about this topic because I remember reviewing Barry Weiss's book about combating anti-Semitism that was like, this was way before October 7th. I reviewed it for JTA. And it's just like, what does this mean, this to fight anti-Semitism? Like, is this something that can be fought via awareness campaigns, via summits? And yes, indeed, like, as you will, I'm sure, bring up more, like, there needs to be, like, if you want Jewish stuff, the fight against anti-Semitism can only be so much, right, of a Jewish identity.
Yeah. So all of what you're saying right now leads me to the conclusion that all the things that people think they are doing to combat anti-Semitism doesn't actually work. Because if you've been spending so much time with all of this rise in anti-Semitism, doing all these things that you are doing, and you are actually seeing a reverse of the effect that you're trying to get out there, maybe it's not that we need to fight doubly hard with all the things that we're doing to make this work. Maybe it's the thing that you're doing doesn't actually work.
Or it's maybe there is nothing that would. That's the other thing that's
maybe a logical conclusion after that. But the primary thing that comes from there is, why is nobody stopping to say to themselves, fighting anti-Semitism doesn't actually help the fight against anti-Semitism, right? The awareness campaigns and the security and the this and the that, clearly it has had zero effect. It's had a negative effect, but yet nobody wants to admit that and recognize that, we need to do something else, or maybe we need to realize that there is nothing that one can do, and that's a little sad and it's a little scary feeling, but you have to recognize that maybe.
I could speak to this a little bit, like,
please,
in terms of, does nobody speak about this? As I said, I certainly did when I reviewed Barry Weiss's book these many years ago. People do say it. You've said it plenty of times yourself. And here we are, like on a Jewish current affairs podcast, like people do talk about this. Maybe it's just the two of us, but people are talking about it. But I think the problem is that, and I've seen this happen in other kind of social justice type arenas, the minute you publicly question anybody's approach, you are presumed to oppose the goals, right? So like this happened there was a professor a while back who was Jewish and in Canada, I think we may have talked about this on the podcast, who opposed some specific DEI, like diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, because he thought they were bad for diversity, equity, and inclusion, not because he opposed diversity, equity, and inclusion as goals. Quite the contrary, right? And then he got cast as, the anti-woke enemy of the day, right? And I think this is the problem, is that if you oppose certain strategies, you just like people don't really think very much. You know what I mean? And so what just happened for me when I wrote about the existence of this book, which I am reading, have not yet finished, am going to have a review of, have not yet reviewed, was that suddenly I was like the enemy of all Zionist Jews everywhere, which was confusing to me, to put it mildly. But it is this thing where, like, if you question any kind of approach, you are assumed to be coming from a bad place.
Yeah. And I will be the first one on the record to say, I think that all of these efforts are misguided. I think that they actually don't do the work that is needed to be done. And from what I've seen, and I haven't researched this extensively, but I've had more than passing, encounters with things that work and things that don't work. And the only thing that seems to work again and again and again is the deep work that is needed to be able to sit down with somebody who actually has the beliefs that you are trying to counter, and to sit down with them and to really engage in a discussion and a dialogue one-on-one, to have small groups. I've seen organizations that will take people on the extreme left and people on the extreme right and sit them down in a room and, have them talk to each other over a long period of time with a certain set of rules for dialogue, for constructive dialogue. That's the kind of thing that works, but that's the kind of thing that requires somebody who is Zionist, who is trying to combat anti-Zionism, or somebody who is a Semite who is trying to combat anti-Semitism, to sit down with the other person and treat them like a human being, instead of just going to a protest or a rally and saying, you don't have the right facts, I have the right facts. That does nothing, right? The thing that works is to sit down and say, hey, let's talk about this. It's complicated. I would love to hear where you're coming from. I would love to talk to you, and to be open to a variety of things. To be on the left and to say maybe the right is right and vice versa is hard, because you're looking at somebody else, you're questioning your own beliefs, and that's the only thing that's going to break this stuff down. And these summits do nothing about that. All they talk about is prevention and getting the facts out there and security. And I'm sorry, but that's not the work that needs to happen. You need to sit down with the other and really look them in the eye and say, hey, let's talk.
That all sounds good. Yeah. I mean, I guess I tend to think that what works is also just like having both laws and norms in place, so that people are not saying that because of a conflict, however many thousands of miles away, that, that makes it okay to be nasty to people locally. You know what I mean?
That's the being. So the problem with that, which is 100%, I think that's necessary, but with that doesn't change the mind of the individual.
And I'm saying I'm not bothered about the minds of the individual. I think people are always going to have I'm
actually with you on that one. I think that what I'm trying to say is that whole rant that I had, it's if you're trying to change somebody's mind, that's the only thing that works. If you're trying to get close and to try to really bring people together and to show that to change somebody's mind involves the ability to say, maybe my mind needs to be changed also. And I'm okay with people having hateful thoughts, just let them go. What happens with these summits is just, there's this perception that we can get rid of anti-Semitism with whatever the tools that they use in these summits. And I'm sorry, but that's wrong. Let's get to another topic that was the subject of a nice piece in the National Post right after this.
There's not that many news outlets that are covering Canadian Jewish arts these days, so we're really doing something unique. Hi, I'm Ilana Zakon.
And I'm David Sklar.
And we're the hosts of Culturally Jewish.
In these times right now of growing anti-Semitism, I think a lot of Jewish artists are feeling very isolated from their own arts communities.
It's very isolating being in the arts world in Canada, and we get a chance to meet people from all over the country who are dealing with it in all sorts of different ways.
It also makes me feel more proud to be a Jewish artist right now. We would say there's no one out there who understands what we're going through, who feels the way we feel. Are we going crazy, right? Or is the world going crazy? And when we get together and we chat with these artists, we say we are not alone, that there are other people who are going through the same thing. And it actually makes me more proud to be a Jew and a Jewish artist.
To support our work and to keep up to date on everything that's happening at the Canadian Jewish News, visit thecjn.ca/donate.
I went from having never heard of Broken Pencil magazine to knowing so much about it now that it's gone, alas. So Hal Nedzvecki, I believe this is how to pronounce his name, was the founder and co-publisher of something called Broken Pencil magazine, a Canadian publication about the zine world. And he started this in 1995. Hal is a Canadian Jew, so, topical for us. But basically, he was under a lot of pressure, including from people who'd been associated with the publication, to do a few different things. One was to devote more of the publication, or any of the publication, I guess, to the Palestinian cause in various ways, and also eventually pressure to step down, because in his own personal postings, he posted pro-Israel content, whereas the publication is for the lefty indie zine landscape of Canada, which is more on the pro-Palestinian side of things. So a zine, for the uninitiated, and I should say it's me, I'm the uninitiated, is a sort of like, well, Avi, can I throw this one to you? Because you know more about magazines than I do. How would you describe a zine?
All the magazines behind me, because I do love magazines. Broadly speaking, and I'm sure there is a more technical definition, a zine is probably a magazine that is a little smaller, right? It's short for Z magazine. It's a little smaller. It's a little more independently published. It has a little more of a DIY feel to it. It's often just one person putting together a couple of little things that they like and sending it out regularly to their friends. But let's just say it's an independently published magazine that usually focuses on, one theme or whatnot.
Thank you for that. So yes, there's a so Hal seems like an interesting guy. I forgot that I had heard of him before, because he had gotten in a little bit of hot water in the ancient year of 2017 when he wrote an opinion article for the Writers' Union of Canada called Winning the Appropriation Prize. It was an argument in favor of cultural appropriation. This was not the thing to say in 2017, not least in what was evidently an issue, I'm quoting from the Globe and Mail coverage of this, an issue devoted to Indigenous writing. So maybe this was, one might say, neither the time nor the place. But so what's interesting is that, this is telling us a little bit of background, that this is somebody who not only has views about Israel that would be out of step with the zine world, but also, and perhaps more importantly, and that's what I want to talk about with you now, is coming at just literature maybe, or literature and art for the zine stuff, from a different place than the kind of pro-social justice side of things. And a lot of this comes through in his statement on the Broken Pencil website, where he explains, I'm quoting now, in recent years, the relentless pursuit of ideological purity and identity politics has overshadowed the core mission of Broken Pencil. Recent events, including online harassment over my personal beliefs, a petition demanding that I resign from the publication I founded, and the magazine formally support the boycott, divest, and sanction Israel movement and devote an entire issue to the conflict in Gaza. I mean, it goes on, but basically, the other part of this that I wanted to focus on is where he writes, this cultural environment has become incompatible with the values of free speech, independent thought, and meaningful dialogue. So, end quote. It's about values that may be sort of indirectly informed from the fact that he's Jewish and has a different stance on Israel than a bunch of people around him. But it's also a different approach, sort of ideologically.
The bizarre thing to me is this person is saying, I'm a Zionist. I want to be able to publish everything. I want to publish non-Zionist, anti-Zionist, lefty work, right-wing work. And the people that are writing or contributing are basically saying, well, you don't have the right to do this because you're a Zionist, and therefore I'm not even going to write, even though this person is being welcoming. The thing that I talked about before, about finding voices which aren't yours and engaging with them and dealing with them, that's not available. That's not happening. And that's hugely problematic because, as he says, ideological purity is bad for art.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting what this whole episode is making me think of. There was a moment in 2020, 2021, where there was a lot of this kind of asking people to step down from things that they had started because, or that they were running, but often things that they'd started because they have the bad politics or they're somehow problematic, it would be phrased, whatever. And that there's something about like, if somebody has created something, like I remember this specifically coming up with the man repeller blogger, who I know I've mentioned before, where I remember there were these kind of calls that like, wouldn't it have been better if instead of it being Leandra Medine Cohen's man repeller, it was some kind of like entity run by the people who worked for her? It's like, well, sure, the people who work for her, I'm sure, are all worthy, but like this was her invention, you know, this was her creation. It wouldn't exist without her. It has her personality on it. Start something else, start your own thing. You know what I mean? Like there's something a little bit like unpleasant to me about people saying that somebody needs to step down from the thing they made. And you also, okay, this is another case where this comes up. J.K. Rowling, people saying that like you should be for Harry Potter, but not for the author, and like somehow willing the author away. It's like people, no, like somebody has created something. You don't have to like the person, attribute authorship. But then the other thing this is making me think of, and that should be making, I assume, both you and anybody listening to this think of, is of course the Gillers. And this whole, we're once again in a situation where what is the net effect here? Well, there's one less literary magazine. And also already there was some associated festival, this Cannes Zine Festival that he was organizing that also stopped, that he had to stop for the same reason. So there's one less literary festival, one less literary magazine. Is something going to come up in its place? Who knows? It just seems like there's a bit of a destruction in the absence of construction happening here.
I like the fact, you were talking about this one authorship sort of thing, oftentimes, even though many people work on a given product, the fact that it is the brainchild of one individual means that that individual gets their name on the cover or on the whatever it is on the title card, and for better or for worse, gets to stand or fall with that piece of work, but then they get to say, this is my piece of work. And if a guy chooses to walk away from a project, it is terribly sad, but that's the way in which you maintain your individuality.
I mean, there's something about that's just somehow upsetting about like you build something and then to be kicked out of the thing you built, right?
Yeah, I think it happens. I don't think he's being kicked out. I think he has made a conscious choice that it cannot continue in this way.
I don't know. I mean, I think this is like when you read in an article that somebody has resigned from a job that they were basically clearly fired from.
Bringing it back to the conversations that we've been having about the Jewish community or about whatever cultural ideas are out there in the world, there's just this, miasma of things which shift with time. 6 years ago, 3 years ago, and now are very different in terms of what it means to be pro-DEI or to be pro-Zionist. And that's a problem for people who want to stand with this idea, and there is no specific guidelines to say this is what it is. And it's very hard for you to be able to point to something and say, this is what I'm standing for.
Like, I sometimes do wonder whether people who are in different sort of teams in culture wars actually have different policy views. This is something I do think about a lot. And my hunch is not always.
Now it's time for our Nachas or Bruigus. Phoebe, I feel like it's a Nachas week.
Yes, I'm going to have to Nachas, I guess. It seems like a weird one to Nachas, but there's an article making the rounds in the New York Times called Misogyny and Antisemitism Are a Toxic Brew by Natalia Melman Petruzella and Rachel Schreiber. I have not read it very closely, but from what I've looked at, it seems like it's like this whole idea of sort of intersectionality and Jews and women. All of this is an interesting topic. I was interested to see an article about it in the New York Times. I wonder whether anybody to whom this sort of thing is news will read it. But yeah, so that seems interesting. What have you got?
I have an op-ed from The Forward, came out on December 3rd, entitled, So Joe Biden's reading Rashid Khalidi, You Should Too. American Jews Need a Better Understanding of the Palestinian Narrative. This is by Rob Eshman, who is a senior columnist for The Forward. In it, he's basically saying that it's important for Jews to understand, or Zionists to understand, what the other side is actually saying in order both to sharpen their own opinions, if that's what it is, or to soften their opinions. He does point out a lot of the failings of the thought in Rashid Khalidi, according to him, but he also will go and say it's important for you to understand where somebody's coming from in order to be able to engage in a dialogue with them. And I think that that would be an interesting project to sort of say, like, hey, what are the books that I think would be important for people on the, anti-Zionist side to read in order to soften their approach to get a better understanding of where Zionists are coming from, to be able to at least talk to them and engage with them, even if they think that they're wrong, but to work with that. But yes, that is the nachas that I have for today. Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending December 6th, Shabbat Parashat Vayetze. The show is produced by Michael Fraiman, edited by Zach Kauffman. The executive producer for CJN Podcast is Michael Fraiman. Our music is by SoCalled. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It's one of the best ways we get new listeners. And as always, you can email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.
My name is Rivka Campbell, and I am the host of the CJN podcast, Rivkush. My podcast, it's a focus on Jews of color talking about anything. It's really important for mainstream Jews to see that I am just as Jewish as you. The topics that interest you also interest me. I want to talk about Israel. You want to talk about Israel. I want to talk about food. Maybe it's not the food you want to talk about, but I want to talk about food. It's important that the person talking about Judaism, Israel, whatever, has a face like mine. It really, hopefully, changes the perception of Jews of color. To support my podcast and the rest of the CJN, please make a tax-deductible donation at thecjn.ca/donate.